Hey, still awake? Yeah, I had a feeling you might be. Maybe work refused to leave your brain alone. Maybe your family accidentally turned today into a group project that nobody volunteered for. Or maybe your mind has simply decided that 2 in the morning is the perfect time to remember every awkward conversation you've had since childhood. If that's where you are tonight, don't worry. You're in good company. Take a slow breath. Let your shoulders sink just a little. Unclench your jaw. You'd be surprised how many people are unknowingly trying to chew invisible medieval bread while lying in bed. Now here's something strangely comforting. No matter how confusing modern life sometimes feels, at least nobody is going to fine you because your shirt is too fancy for your tax bracket. Medieval Europeans actually worried about that. Tonight, we're stepping into a world where your clothes were far more than something to keep you warm. A simple piece of fabric could announce your profession before you opened your mouth. Reveal your family's wealth before anyone asked your name. Expose your legal status before you had spoken a single word, and in some places, even get you into serious trouble if you dressed a little too well. It sounds unbelievable today. Yet for centuries, people accepted this as perfectly normal. So let's wander quietly into the streets of medieval Europe, where cloth was power, color was politics, fashion was law, and owning the wrong pair of sleeves could become a surprisingly complicated life decision. One of the easiest mistakes modern people make is imagining medieval clothing as dull, identical, and hopelessly gray. Hollywood certainly enjoys this version of history. Everyone seems permanently dressed in brown burlap while wandering through permanently muddy streets under permanently gray skies. Reality, as usual, was much stranger. Color was everywhere. Deep reds, rich blues, bright yellows, emerald greens, cream-colored linen, dark wool, silks shimmering in candlelight. The problem was not whether beautiful clothing existed. The problem was whether someone was allowed to wear it. Imagine waking up one morning, opening your closet, choosing a nice jacket, and having your neighbors quietly whisper, "That's ambitious." Not because the jacket was ugly, because it was above your social pay grade. In medieval Europe, clothing functioned almost like an identification card. Before passports, before driver's licenses, before business cards, before social media profiles, where people politely informed strangers about every detail of their breakfast. Your clothes told your story instantly. People could estimate your occupation, your income, your legal status, sometimes your religion, sometimes your hometown, sometimes even whether you were married. And unlike modern fashion, where people occasionally dress like billionaires while eating instant noodles for dinner, medieval society generally expected appearances to match reality. That expectation became so important that governments eventually turned fashion into legislation. Yes, actual clothing laws. They were called sumptuary laws. The name sounds elegant enough to belong to an expensive perfume. In reality, they were essentially medieval dress codes with considerably sharper consequences. Kings, city councils, bishops, and local rulers all became remarkably interested in what people were wearing. Not because they were fashion critics, because clothing maintained order. At least that was the theory. Society was imagined as a carefully arranged ladder. God stood at the top. Then angels, kings, nobles, knights, merchants, craftsmen, peasants, servants. Every rung had responsibilities. Every rung supposedly accepted its place. Clothing helped make this invisible ladder visible. If everyone dressed according to rank, society became easier to understand. Or so medieval lawmakers hoped. Human beings, unfortunately, have always possessed a remarkable talent for ignoring instructions involving attractive clothing. Successful merchants became richer. Artisans accumulated wealth. Some farmers owned surprisingly productive land. Their incomes improved. Naturally, they wanted nicer clothes. Honestly, who wouldn't? Imagine working hard for decades, finally earning enough money for beautiful imported fabric, only to hear someone announce, "Congratulations on your success." Unfortunately, silk is illegal for someone with your grandparents. That was essentially the logic. Money alone did not determine status. Birth mattered. Family mattered. Titles mattered. Ancient bloodlines mattered. The expensive cloak might belong on your shoulders financially. Socially, however, many believed it belonged somewhere else entirely. This produced endless frustration, especially in growing medieval cities. Commerce created wealthy commoners. Trade connected Europe to distant markets. Italian merchants imported luxurious silks. English wool became internationally famous. Flemish cloth reached astonishing levels of quality. Textile production exploded into one of Europe's largest industries. Beautiful clothing became increasingly available, which created a terrifying possibility. People might start looking equal. For aristocrats, this was less exciting than it sounds. Noble identity depended partly on being immediately recognizable. If prosperous merchants dressed exactly like counts and barons, how could strangers instantly distinguish them? The medieval solution was wonderfully straightforward. Simply outlaw dressing too well. Problem solved, at least on parchment. Reality proved considerably messier. Take purple, for example. Long before medieval Europe, purple had become associated with extraordinary prestige. The dye was astonishingly expensive. Some varieties required thousands upon thousands of tiny sea snails to produce only a small amount of pigment. Imagine collecting shellfish, one microscopic drop at a time, simply so someone could own an especially fashionable cloak. Human ambition has always displayed impressive determination. Because purple remained rare and costly, rulers often restricted its use. Not everyone could wear it. In certain places, attempting to imitate elite styles risked punishment. Color itself became a form of political language. Blue carried fascinating symbolism too. Today, blue feels almost ordinary. Jeans, sweaters, shirts, coffee mugs, half the world's bedrooms. But medieval blue, especially deep, brilliant blue, represented considerable wealth. Producing stable blue dyes required skilled resources and sometimes imported materials. Rich blue garments communicated success almost before the wearer entered a room. Red held equally complicated meanings. Certain shades suggested authority. Others implied wealth. Scarlet cloth often required expensive imported dyes. The richer the red, the deeper someone else's wallet had probably become. Then there was black. Oddly enough, black eventually became one of the most luxurious colors available. Modern people often assume black is simple. Just remove color. Done. Medieval textile makers would probably laugh gently while continuing several weeks of complicated dyeing techniques. Creating rich, even lasting black required exceptional craftsmanship. Cheap black quickly faded into disappointing gray or muddy brown. High-quality black remained rich and elegant. By the late Middle Ages, wealthy merchants frequently embraced black clothing as an understated demonstration of extraordinary prosperity. Nothing says confidence quite like spending a fortune making expensive cloth appear deceptively simple. Even fur carried legal meaning. Not all fur was equal. Far from it. Rabbit might be acceptable. Fox suggested greater prestige. Ermine became closely linked with royalty and high nobility. Those tiny white winter pelts trimmed magnificent ceremonial robes throughout Europe. The message required no words. I belong near the top, or at least, I know someone who does. Jewelry operated under similar rules. Pearls, gold chains, gemstones, decorated belts, silver buckles. Each item quietly announced financial resources and social position. Some cities regulated not only fabrics, but even how many rings someone could legally display. Imagine medieval lawmakers conducting serious debates over whether your third necklace represented dangerous social instability. History occasionally resembles a village council that accidentally acquired legislative authority. The irony, of course, was impossible to escape. The very existence of these laws proved people constantly ignored them. If nobody tried dressing above their station, lawmakers would never have bothered writing regulations in the first place. Which means medieval Europeans were every bit as interested in looking impressive as people today, perhaps even more so. After all, without photographs, first impressions depended almost entirely upon appearance. A well-cut cloak could influence negotiations. An elegant hat might open conversations. Fine embroidery hinted at prosperous relatives. Beautiful shoes suggested stable finances, or possibly remarkable debt. Some things truly never change, and that little mystery, whether appearance reflected reality or aspiration, made medieval streets far more colorful, competitive, and quietly humorous than many modern people ever imagine. Tomorrow night, we can continue following the threads of this remarkable world, where every stitch, every sleeve, and every carefully chosen color carried a story that everyone around you already believed they could read. The story drifts deeper into the hidden language of medieval clothing, once you realize that garments did far more than keep people warm. A tunic, a hood, or a strip of dyed cloth quietly announced where someone belonged long before they ever opened their mouth. Medieval society adored categories with the enthusiasm of an overworked librarian determined to shelve every human being in exactly the correct place. Clothing became one of its favorite labels because fabric could be seen instantly, while character required the troublesome effort of conversation. Imagine arriving at a bustling market just after sunrise. Before anyone asks your name, they have already formed several opinions based entirely on what covers your shoulders. If your cloak is finely woven and trimmed with expensive fur, merchants straighten their backs just a little. If your shoes are patched so many times that they resemble philosophical debates stitched together with thread, people assume your purse is equally exhausted. Modern fashion certainly inspires quick judgments, but medieval Europe elevated this habit into something approaching a civic duty. Looking at someone's clothing was not considered rude. It was considered practical. The outfit explained almost everything authorities believed they needed to know. This created an interesting paradox. Everyone wanted to appear prosperous, respectable, and successful. At the same time, looking too prosperous, if you lacked the legal right, could become a genuine problem. Human beings have always enjoyed pretending to be slightly wealthier than reality permits. Medieval governments noticed this unfortunate consistency with increasing irritation. The result was the creation of what historians call sumptuary laws. Now there is a phrase that sounds wonderfully harmless, almost like a recipe for herbal tea. In reality, these regulations attempted to control exactly who could wear particular fabrics, colors, jewelry, embroidery, furs, hats, sleeves, belts, buttons, and decorative accessories. Imagine your local government announcing tomorrow that only accountants are allowed to wear blue jackets. Teachers may own velvet only on Tuesdays, and anyone caught wearing expensive sneakers without noble ancestry must pay a heavy fine. Ridiculous, yet medieval lawmakers would probably nod approvingly and ask why anyone had waited so long to implement such sensible reforms. These laws appeared across England, France, Italy, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, and many other regions. Their official explanation sounded respectable enough. They supposedly preserved social order. They discouraged wasteful spending. They prevented pride. They protected traditional hierarchy. Unofficially, They also helped ensure that wealthy merchants did not accidentally resemble ancient aristocratic families who had spent centuries perfecting the difficult art of inheriting land while avoiding manual labor. Money alone could become surprisingly awkward. A successful merchant might accumulate enormous wealth through trade. He could own warehouses, ships, property, employees, gold. Yet he still risked criticism if his clothing suggested he belonged among hereditary nobles. Apparently, earning a fortune through hard work remained less socially comforting than inheriting one through an exceptionally fortunate collection of grandparents. It was a wonderfully medieval way of saying, "Congratulations on becoming rich. Please try not to look rich." Color played an especially fascinating role. Today, people choose clothing colors because they enjoy them, because they match shoes, or because the laundry happened to leave only one clean shirt. Medieval Europeans often viewed color very differently. Bright colors required expensive dyes. Producing vivid cloth demanded imported materials, specialized knowledge, and considerable labor. Deep crimson might require costly substances derived from insects. Brilliant blue often depended upon imported pigments or carefully cultivated dye plants. Rich purple carried centuries of association with imperial prestige, stretching back to ancient Rome. Every vibrant garment quietly represented enormous economic effort. When someone wore brilliant scarlet through a muddy medieval street, they were not merely displaying fashion. They were displaying an investment portfolio disguised as fabric. Natural wool appeared far more common. Undyed gray, brown, cream, soft, earthy colors. These shades reflected ordinary life because they required far less expensive processing. That does not mean medieval peasants dressed only in dull clothing. Quite the opposite. Many people loved cheerful colors whenever circumstances allowed. Plant dyes produced greens, yellows, reds, and blues in varying shades. But achieving consistently brilliant colors remained costly. Luxury always carried its own price tag, and medieval observers noticed immediately. Even children learned these visual signals. Without reading books or studying law, they absorbed society's invisible dress code simply by watching adults interact. A richly dressed traveler received different treatment than a poorly clothed laborer. Doors opened differently. Greetings sounded warmer. Credit became easier. Hospitality expanded, all because of woven thread. It is strangely comforting, in an ironic sort of way, to discover that humans have always been vulnerable to attractive packaging. Apparently, expensive fabric has been performing persuasive speeches for nearly 1,000 years. Sleeves deserve their own quiet moment of appreciation. Because medieval sleeves occasionally became gloriously impractical, long flowing sleeves, wide sleeves, decorated sleeves, sleeves trimmed with fur, sleeves embroidered with gold thread. Some garments possessed sleeves large enough to make ordinary household activities resemble advanced engineering projects. One imagines a noblewoman attempting dinner while simultaneously negotiating a relationship with fabric determined to introduce itself personally to every candle flame. Fashion rarely asks practical questions. It simply smiles politely while practicality waits outside. Shoes told stories too. A peasant's shoes endured fields, mud rain, livestock stones, and endless repairs. Leather remained valuable. Many shoes survived through repeated patching. Cobblers performed quiet miracles, extending footwear far beyond its intended lifespan. Some shoes probably contained more repair work than original leather. Meanwhile, fashionable elites occasionally embraced pointed shoes, so dramatically elongated that walking naturally became almost optional. The famous poulaines featured absurdly extended toes. Some curled upward, some required stuffing. Some even needed small chains attaching the tips to the leg, so wearers would avoid tripping over their own elegance. Imagine inventing footwear requiring additional engineering merely to prevent immediate collapse. Fashion truly possesses remarkable optimism. Naturally, critics complained. Religious writers condemned vanity. Moralists warned against excessive pride. Older generations sighed with impressive consistency. Apparently, every century eventually produces someone insisting that young people's shoes have become completely unreasonable. History remains comforting in this respect. Parents have always believed fashion reached perfection, approximately 25 years before their children selected clothing independently. Headwear proved equally revealing. Married women often covered their hair. Veils, wimples, linen wraps. Head coverings carried religious significance, cultural expectation, and social symbolism. Hair itself possessed complicated meanings. Loose, uncovered hair frequently suggested youth, unmarried status, or intimacy within private settings. Covered hair communicated maturity, modesty, and respectable adulthood. These customs varied enormously across regions and centuries. Medieval Europe never behaved as one unified culture. Instead, it resembled hundreds of neighboring communities, enthusiastically agreeing upon the importance of clothing, while politely disagreeing about almost everything else. Meanwhile, noblewomen embraced astonishing architectural achievements disguised as hairstyles. Elaborate braids, jewels, silk ribbons, decorative nets, headdresses reaching impressive heights. Some fashions became so dramatic they required careful balance worthy of experienced construction workers. Again, practicality quietly excused itself from the conversation. Religious authorities frequently criticized excessive luxury. Sermons warned against vanity, pride, worldliness, temptation. Yet churches themselves often displayed magnificent textiles, embroidered vestments, gleaming ceremonial robes, and precious fabrics reserved for sacred rituals. Human beings possess an extraordinary ability to condemn luxury immediately before putting on ceremonial luxury for entirely different reasons. Consistency occasionally wandered off to find lunch. Clothing also carried emotional memories. A widow might preserve her husband's cloak. A family might pass garments through generations. Children inherited carefully altered clothing from older siblings. Fabric represented labor too valuable for waste. Nothing disappeared casually. Worn clothing became work clothes, then patches, then children's garments, then household cloths, then stuffing. Eventually, almost every useful fiber completed several different careers before finally retiring. Modern closets occasionally contain forgotten jackets purchased during optimistic shopping trips. Medieval wardrobes rarely enjoyed such extravagance. Every garment justified its existence repeatedly. Every stitch mattered. Every repair extended survival. Needles themselves remained treasured possessions. Spinning thread required endless patience. Weaving demanded expertise. Sewing consumed valuable hours. A single well-made garment represented weeks or months of collective labor. Looking at medieval clothing without appreciating its production is rather like admiring a cathedral while ignoring the stonecutters. The object appears simple. Its creation never was. Interestingly, thieves often targeted clothing, not because fashion magazines inspired them, because garments possessed genuine monetary value. Fine cloaks, belts, fur trim, quality boots. These items could be sold, traded, or reused. A beautiful cloak sometimes represented wealth portable enough to carry across one's shoulders. No wonder travelers guarded possessions carefully. Every journey involved balancing appearance with caution. Dress too richly and thieves noticed. Dress too poorly and respectable opportunities disappeared. Finding the comfortable middle required experience. There was also the curious phenomenon of borrowed clothing. Families shared garments. Friends occasionally borrowed expensive outfits for weddings or celebrations. Servants sometimes received older clothing from employers. Cast-off garments trickled slowly down the social ladder. A nobleman's outdated cloak might eventually warm several entirely different owners across decades. Fashion itself traveled through society, one carefully worn sleeve at a time. Perhaps the most quietly fascinating aspect of medieval clothing lies not in laws or luxury, but in identity. People genuinely believed clothing shaped behavior. Put on respectable garments, stand straighter, speak differently, receive different treatment. Modern psychology would probably recognize elements of this immediately. Our clothing still influences confidence, expectation, and perception. The medieval world simply acknowledged this relationship with fewer illusions. Fabric carried authority because everyone collectively agreed that it did, which is when one pauses thoughtfully how many human customs quietly operate. A strip of dyed wool possesses no natural understanding of social hierarchy. People supplied that meaning themselves, generation after generation, century after century, and somehow thousands accepted the arrangement without requiring the wool's opinion. As evening settled across medieval towns, garments finally relaxed alongside their owners. Fine cloaks hung carefully from wooden pegs. Working tunics dried beside hearth fires. Boots rested after trudging muddy roads. Needles repaired tomorrow's tears under flickering candlelight. Outside, darkness softened distinctions invisible beneath moonlight. A nobleman's velvet looked remarkably similar to a shepherd's wool, once shadows covered both equally. Perhaps there is something quietly comforting about that image. After an entire day spent announcing rank, occupation, ambition, wealth, respectability, and expectation, every piece of clothing eventually surrendered to the same gentle darkness. The fabric stopped speaking, the hierarchy grew quieter, and for a few peaceful hours before dawn, everyone simply became another sleeping human, wrapped against the cold, reminding us that beneath all the carefully stitched symbols, people have always searched for exactly the same simple comforts: warmth, safety, belonging, and the hope that tomorrow's clothes, however humble or magnificent, would once again help them face another ordinary day. By the time we move beyond the cloth itself, another surprisingly strange question quietly appears. If clothing revealed almost everything about who you were, what happened when someone deliberately tried to look like someone else? Medieval society, which usually preferred every person to remain neatly sorted into their assigned social drawer, found that question deeply unsettling. Now, people have always enjoyed dressing up. Children wrap blankets around their shoulders and become kings. Adults rent elaborate costumes for celebrations. Actors transform into entirely different people, with little more than fabric and confidence. Medieval Europe, however, often viewed clothing as something much closer to legal identification. Changing your appearance could mean changing how the world treated you. That possibility fascinated some people. It terrified others. Imagine arriving in a busy market wearing expensive wool trimmed with modest fur. You carry yourself confidently. Your boots are clean. Your belt is decorated with polished brass. Shopkeepers greet you warmly. Credit suddenly becomes available. People assume you must be trustworthy because your sleeves appear to have excellent financial credentials. Now imagine wearing the exact same face beneath patched linen, cracked shoes, and a faded hood. The conversation changes almost instantly. Nothing about your intelligence has altered. Nothing about your honesty. Nothing about your character. Only the cloth. History can occasionally feel like one enormous psychological experiment conducted without informed consent. This explains why authorities became increasingly concerned whenever people blurred visual boundaries. Merchants dressed like nobles. Servants wearing discarded aristocratic clothing, young apprentices borrowing elegant garments for festivals, travelers purchasing second-hand cloaks far beyond what their neighbors expected them to own. Every one of these situations created uncertainty, and uncertainty was something medieval governments disliked almost as much as unpaid taxes. Clothing laws, therefore, served another hidden purpose. They protected certainty. Everyone should know who everyone else supposedly was. At least that was the theory. Reality remained far more creative. Second-hand clothing markets flourished throughout medieval Europe. Garments were expensive enough that throwing them away would have seemed almost unbelievable. Instead, they circulated endlessly. A wealthy household replaced old tunics. Servants received them. Servants eventually sold them. Tailors altered them. Another owner repaired them. Years later, the same garment might appear in an entirely different town, covering someone whose grandparents had never met the original owner. A cloak could live several social lives. Its stitches quietly witnessed generations of changing fortunes. There is something oddly beautiful about that. Modern fashion often celebrates the newest purchase. Medieval clothing celebrated survival. Every patch became part of a biography. Every repair represented another season endured. Tailors themselves occupied an unexpectedly interesting position within society. At first glance, they simply stitched cloth together. In reality, they helped manufacture identity. A skilled tailor could make modest fabric appear respectable. A careless tailor could accidentally transform expensive cloth into something resembling a disappointed curtain. Measurements mattered. Cuts mattered. Even the angle of a sleeve influenced how observers judged status. Tailors understood fashion trends better than almost anyone else. They watched social ambition arrive at their workshops, wearing hopeful expressions. Customers frequently requested styles associated with higher ranks. Perhaps just slightly longer sleeves, maybe a richer-looking collar. Could we make this resemble something worn in the royal court? Human optimism has always been wonderfully predictable. Most of us secretly believe one excellent outfit will somehow persuade life to become dramatically easier. Tailors probably smiled politely while accepting payment. Cloth merchants possessed their own quiet expertise. They could identify fabrics through touch alone. Wool, linen, silk, fine broadcloth, coarse homespun. Each possessed distinctive textures that experienced hands recognized immediately. Imagine running your fingers across dozens of woven surfaces every single day until your sense of touch became as informative as someone else's eyesight. That level of craftsmanship developed slowly through years of practice. Markets themselves became colorful theaters of social observation. Women examining dyed cloth, merchants negotiating prices, travelers comparing regional fashions, children staring wide-eyed at fabrics their families could never afford. Even those unable to purchase luxury still enjoyed looking at it. Apparently, window shopping existed centuries before glass shop windows became common. People simply admired beautiful goods from slightly muddier locations. Foreign fabrics inspired particular fascination. Italian silk, Flemish wool, Eastern textiles carried by ambitious traders. Exotic materials traveled extraordinary distances before reaching European markets. A bolt of luxurious fabric might cross mountains, rivers, seas, and political borders before finally becoming someone's ceremonial robe. The cloth itself accumulated a remarkable travel history. Most owners probably never realized how many strangers had touched it first. Monasteries contributed surprisingly important roles in textile production as well. Monks and nuns spun thread, wove cloth, embroidered religious garments, maintained workshops where patients quietly transformed raw fiber into practical beauty. Religious communities valued labor not merely for economic reasons, but spiritual ones. Working carefully with one's hands became another form of discipline. Thread followed prayer. Needle followed reflection. There is something deeply peaceful about imagining those slow, repetitive movements. The steady rhythm, the soft scrape of linen, the quiet concentration. Even today, many people find sewing calming. Perhaps thousands of years separate us from medieval artisans, yet our minds still appreciate the same gentle patterns of focused work. Embroidery deserves special admiration, not because it solved practical problems. It rarely did. Instead, embroidery solved emotional ones. Humans have always desired beauty. Even difficult lives leave room for decoration. Small flowers stitched into cuffs, tiny geometric designs, religious symbols, family patterns, personal touches almost invisible unless someone looked closely. These details transformed ordinary clothing into deeply personal possessions. One stitch at a time, one evening at a time, one winter beside the fire at a time. For noble households, embroidery sometimes expanded into astonishing displays of wealth. Gold thread, silver thread, pearls sewn directly into fabric, tiny jewels, intricate scenes depicting saints, animals, hunting expeditions, mythical creatures. Some garments resembled portable art galleries. Imagine wearing enough embroidery that 2 servants became necessary simply to help you get dressed. History occasionally demonstrates remarkable confidence in humanity's willingness to complicate mornings. Children experienced clothing differently. Few garments belonged exclusively to them. Young children often wore simplified versions of adult styles. Clothing needed room for growth. Parents expected garments to last. A child's tunic might be altered repeatedly over several years. Hem lowered, sleeves extended, panels added, nothing wasted. Growing taller represented less of a family celebration than another tailoring challenge. Teenagers occasionally introduced their own modest rebellions, not entirely unlike modern teenagers. Perhaps a fashionable hat, an unusually colorful belt, a slightly exaggerated hairstyle. Older generations inevitably worried civilization might collapse because younger people preferred different clothing. Remarkably, civilization displayed stubborn resilience. Guilds also used clothing to express identity. Craftsmen often possessed recognizable dress associated with particular trades. Certain aprons, belts, working garments, tools hanging visibly. You could sometimes identify a profession simply by observing clothing before hearing conversation. Blacksmith, carpenter, baker, mason. Occupation became another layer stitched into appearance. Pilgrims carried especially distinctive clothing. Simple cloaks, broad hats, walking staffs, special badges collected from sacred destinations. These small metal badges functioned almost like medieval travel souvenirs. Returning pilgrims proudly displayed them. Each badge quietly announced, "Yes, I survived an extremely uncomfortable journey." Anyone who has returned from modern airports carrying tiny refrigerator magnets may appreciate the enduring human desire to prove travel occurred. Perhaps the most moving garments belong to mourners. Darker clothing, simple veils, restrained decoration. Different regions practiced mourning differently, but clothing frequently helped express grief publicly. Words often fail after loss. Fabric occasionally spoke instead. The medieval world understood that sorrow possessed its own visible language. Marriage created another wardrobe transformation. A bride's clothing announced not merely celebration, but transition. From daughter to wife, from one household to another, from one legal identity toward another complicated collection of expectations. Wedding garments varied enormously depending upon wealth and region. Contrary to popular imagination, white wedding dresses remained far from universal. Fine blue, red, green, gold, rich colors frequently appeared. Practical families even selected garments suitable for future reuse. An expensive dress worn only once would have seemed almost painfully extravagant. Even joyful occasions remembered household economics. Meanwhile, servants watched these ceremonies while wearing entirely different clothing. Yet everyone participated somehow. Cooking, preparing halls, decorating spaces, carrying benches, serving meals. washing dishes afterward. History often remembers the bride's dress, while forgetting the dozens of ordinary workers whose own simpler garments quietly supported the entire celebration. There lies another gentle irony. The most spectacular clothing usually depended upon countless unnoticed people dressed far more modestly. As medieval towns gradually expanded during later centuries, another fascinating shift occurred. Fashion began changing faster. Trade increased, ideas traveled more quickly, styles migrated between regions. What seemed wonderfully modern one decade occasionally looked hopelessly outdated the next. People started chasing novelty. That instinct should sound comfortably familiar. Apparently, humans have always glanced at last year's clothing and whispered, "Well, we can probably do better." Whether they actually did remains open to friendly debate. The most remarkable lesson hidden inside medieval clothing may not concern hierarchy at all. Instead, it reveals how desperately people hope to be recognized correctly, not admired necessarily, not envied, simply understood. A widow dressed as a widow, a craftsman as a craftsman, a pilgrim as a pilgrim, a merchant as a merchant. Their garments quietly answered questions before anyone asked them. Who are you? Where do you belong? Can I trust you? What life have you lived? Today we answer many of those questions differently, yet not entirely differently. We still choose clothes for interviews, celebrations, funerals, weddings, work, comfort. Identity continues speaking through fabric, although perhaps with softer accents. The medieval world simply spoke that language more loudly, and as evening settled once again across narrow streets lined with timber houses, cloaks were folded, boots, removed belts, loosened veils, carefully pinned aside, and embroidered sleeves finally rested after another long day of announcing identities to everyone who happened to look. The clothing became silent. The people beneath it remained wonderfully, reassuringly human. As the centuries continued their patient march forward, clothing slowly became something even more remarkable than a marker of rank or profession. It became memory itself. Long before photographs could preserve a familiar smile, or written diaries could capture ordinary lives, fabric quietly absorbed the stories of the people who wore it. Imagine opening a heavy wooden chest in a medieval farmhouse. Inside lies a carefully folded cloak that belonged to a grandfather who died many winters ago. Nearby rests a linen apron, still carrying faint traces of careful repairs made by a grandmother whose hands once spun thread beside the hearth every evening. There is a child's tiny tunic, impossibly small now, reminding everyone that children somehow insist on growing faster than parents ever expect. None of these garments possess magical powers, yet they hold something equally extraordinary. They remember, not with words, not with photographs, but through worn elbows, faded colors, polished belt holes, and carefully mended seams. Every repair quietly announces that someone believed this piece of cloth deserved another chance. In many ways, medieval people repaired clothing the way they repaired relationships, patiently, repeatedly, sometimes imperfectly, but usually with the hope that one more careful stitch might keep everything together just a little longer. Modern wardrobes often change with astonishing speed. A fashionable jacket appears, a newer one replaces it months later. Entire closets quietly rotate through changing trends. For medieval families, however, a single good garment might remain part of daily life for decades. A cloak could accompany someone through childhood courtship, marriage, parenthood, and old age. Imagine wearing the same outer garment while witnessing nearly every important chapter of your life. The cloth itself would become something like a silent companion. Perhaps this explains why wills occasionally mention clothing with remarkable precision. A father might leave his best cloak to one son, a carefully embroidered hood to a daughter, a treasured belt to a grandson, not because these objects were merely expensive, because they carried family history. Receiving such a garment meant inheriting part of another person's everyday existence. There is something deeply moving about that. Today we inherit photo albums. They inherited sleeves. The emotional importance of clothing appeared especially during times of loss. When someone died, their garments rarely disappeared. They were washed, repaired, redistributed among surviving relatives, sometimes altered to fit a new owner. The fabric continued living even after the person no longer could. In an age where nearly everything required enormous labor, to produce cloth refused to become waste simply because grief had arrived. Instead, memory remained wearable. One can almost imagine a widow fastening a cloak that once belonged to her husband before stepping outside into another cold morning. The garment still warmed her shoulders. Its familiar folds probably carried echoes of countless ordinary days. History rarely records such quiet moments, yet they almost certainly happened thousands of times. Children experienced these inherited garments differently. A boy might proudly receive his father's old belt, though it hung awkwardly around his smaller waist. A young girl might watch an older sister shorten sleeves or adjust hems that had already belonged to several generations. Growing up often meant literally growing into someone else's clothing. The idea feels surprisingly comforting. No one truly started from nothing. Every child entered a world already woven together by countless earlier hands. Even patches possessed emotional meaning. Modern people sometimes view patched clothing as evidence of poverty. Medieval families often saw something else. Evidence of persistence. A patch announced that the garment remained useful, that someone cared enough to preserve it. That waste would not have the final word. Some garments became almost mosaics of survival, original cloth surrounded by generations of additions. One square from an old blanket, another from a worn tunic, a third stitched from leftover linen. Every patch represented another winter endured. Another harvest completed, another year survived. One almost wants to shake hands with whoever first looked at a torn sleeve and calmly declared, "Well, let's simply add another piece." That practical optimism quietly sustained civilizations. Of course, fashion never stopped evolving. Even villages received occasional glimpses of changing styles carried by travelers, merchants, pilgrims, or wandering craftsmen. Imagine the excitement surrounding someone returning from a distant city wearing a slightly different hat. Neighbors probably examined every detail. Questions inevitably followed. Do people really dress like that there? Is everyone wearing sleeves that wide now? Surely that cannot be comfortable. Humans have always enjoyed discussing other people's clothing. The only thing that changes is whether the conversation happens beside a medieval well or beneath modern social media posts. One fascinating development involved buttons. During much of the early Middle Ages, buttons existed primarily as decoration. Garments were secured using belts, brooches, ties, or pins. Later, functional buttons became increasingly common across Europe. This tiny innovation quietly transformed tailoring. Clothing could fit more closely. Sleeves became narrower. Shapes changed. Silhouettes evolved. Imagine history being altered partly because someone realized tiny round objects with holes could hold fabric together more efficiently. Sometimes civilization advances through enormous discoveries. Sometimes through remarkably determined button makers. Shoes reveal another forgotten world of quiet complexity. Many medieval people owned only one reliable pair. Boots accompanied farmers through muddy fields. Leather shoes carried merchants across rough roads. Pilgrims walked hundreds of miles wearing footwear repeatedly repaired by local cobblers. Each sole gradually molded itself to one unique foot. Unlike factory-made shoes, these slowly adapted to their owners. When they finally wore beyond repair replacing them, represented genuine expense. One suspects medieval people looked after their footwear with far greater gratitude than many of us display toward closets containing dozens of pairs. Weather influenced clothing every single day. Rain transformed wool into heavy armor. Snow demanded additional layers. Summer encouraged lighter linen whenever possible. Unlike climate-controlled modern buildings, medieval homes offered little protection from seasonal extremes. Clothing functioned as portable architecture. Your cloak became another wall, your hood another roof, your gloves another fireplace, at least in optimistic theory. Night brought another transformation. The splendid garments that announced status during daylight disappeared beneath simpler sleeping clothes, or sometimes beneath almost nothing at all. Practicality usually defeated elegance. Fine embroidery rested. Jewelry was removed. Belts loosened. The elaborate public version of oneself quietly dissolved into the ordinary human being preparing for sleep. Perhaps there is a gentle lesson hidden there. Every magnificent noble eventually removed expensive robes. Every wealthy merchant loosened uncomfortable boots. Every bishop folded ceremonial garments. Beneath layers of social identity waited exactly the same tired person, hoping tomorrow might be slightly warmer than today. The church itself maintained an interesting relationship with clothing. Religious leaders frequently warned against excessive vanity. Pride remained spiritually dangerous. Yet churches also commissioned astonishing textiles. Magnificent vestments shimmered with gold thread. Altars displayed embroidered cloths requiring extraordinary craftsmanship. The contradiction rarely escaped notice. Humans possess remarkable talent for criticizing luxury while simultaneously appreciating beautiful things. Medieval society proved no exception. Monks sometimes copied manuscripts describing humble virtue while wearing robes woven with impressive skill. Not necessarily extravagant, but undeniably beautiful. Apparently appreciating craftsmanship and avoiding vanity required a careful balancing act, one that humanity continues attempting today. Pilgrimages created unexpected fashion exchanges. Travelers crossed kingdoms carrying local clothing traditions into unfamiliar regions. Ideas migrated through conversation, observation, and simple curiosity. Perhaps someone admired an unusual cloak fastening seen hundreds of miles away. Months later, similar designs appeared back home. Fashion occasionally spread, not because kings demanded it, but because ordinary people quietly borrowed good ideas from one another. History often advances through imitation rather than invention. By now, the medieval wardrobe has become far more than fabric. It has become language, economics, memory, weather protection, family history, legal identity, professional advertisement, religious symbolism, emotional comfort, survival itself. Remarkably few objects carried so many responsibilities simultaneously, and perhaps that explains why clothing inspired such careful attention. It was never just clothing, it was life stitched together. As generations came and went, castles slowly weathered, villages expanded or disappeared, trade routes shifted, kingdoms rose, kingdoms faded, languages changed. Yet somewhere in countless forgotten homes, another mother patiently patched another child's sleeve. Another tailor measured another apprentice. Another shepherd wrapped himself against another freezing dawn. History often celebrates crowns. Daily life quietly depended upon cloaks. Eventually, many medieval garments vanished altogether. Fabric decays. Moths remain impressively democratic. Fire ignores embroidery. Moisture slowly wins nearly every argument against cloth. Only rare examples survived in exceptionally dry tombs, waterlogged wells, frozen ground, or carefully preserved church treasuries. Because of this, historians often reconstruct medieval clothing from paintings, written descriptions, archaeological fragments, and patient detective work. Imagine trying to understand an entire civilization after most of its wardrobes quietly disappeared. It is rather like attempting to understand modern life centuries from now, using only a handful of shoes and several forgotten laundry receipts. Yet despite those challenges, enough evidence remains to reveal something wonderfully reassuring. The people beneath those garments were astonishingly familiar. They worried about appearances. They wanted acceptance. They admired beauty. They complained about uncomfortable fashions. They treasured favorite clothing. They repaired beloved possessions. They handed meaningful garments to children. They laughed when someone wore something ridiculous. They occasionally regretted expensive purchases. Some things, it seems, never truly change. Perhaps that is the quiet magic hidden inside medieval clothing. Not the dyes, not the embroidery, not the strict laws, not even the dramatic social hierarchies. The real mystery is how recognizable everyone still feels. Across hundreds of years, separated by different languages, beliefs, technologies, and worlds that barely resemble our own people, continued performing one deeply human ritual every morning. They opened a chest, reached for familiar cloth, wondered what today's clothing might quietly say about them, and then stepped outside to meet another ordinary day. The centuries have carried away their names, their conversations, and nearly every thread they ever wore. Yet somewhere beneath the silence left by time, one can almost imagine the soft rustle of wool, the careful tying of a belt, the gentle adjustment of a hood before sunrise, and another ordinary person preparing to face the world exactly as generations before and after always would. History may preserve the garments only in fragments, but the humanity inside them remains astonishingly whole. Now, as our journey gradually reaches its quiet conclusion, the clothing itself begins to fade into the background, and what remains is something far larger than fabric fashion or forgotten medieval laws. What remains is the remarkably familiar human desire to belong. After spending these hours wandering through medieval streets, castle halls, village markets, monasteries, and smoky cottages, it becomes almost impossible to think about a simple cloak in quite the same way again. At first, it looked like nothing more than cloth. Then it became law. Then identity. Then memory. Then survival. And finally, almost without noticing it, became a mirror reflecting the people who wore it. History often plays this gentle trick. It invites us to study objects. We end up discovering ourselves. Perhaps that explains why archaeologists become so excited over discoveries that seem wonderfully ordinary. A worn leather shoe, a broken belt buckle, a rusted clothing pin, a fragment of dyed wool no larger than a hand. To someone walking past an excavation, these objects appear almost disappointingly small. Surely, history must be hidden inside golden crowns or magnificent swords. Yet experienced historians know something different. Kings rarely represent ordinary life. Buttons do. The grand speeches of rulers tell us what powerful people hoped would happen. Laundry tells us what actually happened. There is a quiet honesty in everyday objects. They cannot exaggerate. A patched sleeve simply admits that someone kept repairing it. A polished buckle quietly proves frequent use. A faded cloak reveals years beneath rain smoke, sunlight, and ordinary mornings. Unlike written chronicles, clothing has no interest in flattering its owner. It simply records life one wrinkle at a time. Imagine walking through the ruins of a forgotten medieval village just before sunset. The houses have long since collapsed. Only low stone foundations remain. Wild grass grows where children once played. The marketplace is silent. The blacksmith's forge is cold. No voices drift between the buildings. No church bell marks the passing hour. Only birds and wind remain. At first glance, everything appears empty. But then your imagination begins quietly filling the silence. Someone once hurried across this path carrying freshly washed linen. Someone else adjusted a wool cloak before opening a shop. A young apprentice nervously straightened his only decent tunic before meeting a guildmaster. A bride carefully smoothed her wedding gown. An old woman patiently repaired stockings beside a doorway while chatting with neighbors who have now been gone for centuries. None of them imagined they were creating history. They believed they were simply living another Tuesday. Perhaps that is the greatest irony of all. History is rarely created during dramatic moments. It accumulates through ordinary routines repeated millions of times. One stitch, one meal, one market visit, one rainy morning, one carefully folded cloak placed inside a wooden chest before bed. Even the famous castles that still stand across Europe today tell surprisingly humble stories when viewed closely. Tourists naturally admire towers, walls, and great halls, yet historians often find themselves fascinated by laundry yards, storage rooms, kitchen fireplaces, workshops, sleeping chambers, places where ordinary life quietly unfolded beyond the reach of dramatic political events. Because that is where humanity truly lived, not inside coronations, inside routines. There is something wonderfully comforting about that realization. Our own lives often feel too ordinary to matter. We answer emails, wash dishes, fold clothes, walk to work, repair broken things, prepare dinner, repeat tomorrow. Medieval people probably felt much the same. They rarely knew future generations might someday wonder about their shoes, their belts, or the colors they chose to wear. They simply did what needed doing. Perhaps they occasionally complained while doing it. That part also seems timeless. It is tempting to imagine history as one continuous parade of extraordinary individuals, great rulers, legendary warriors, brilliant philosophers, remarkable inventors. Yet every one of those famous people depended upon countless anonymous workers. Tailors stitched their robes, shepherds raised the sheep, weavers produced cloth, dyers colored fabric, merchants transported goods, cobblers repaired shoes. Without those forgotten people, history's most celebrated figures would have spent rather uncomfortable afternoons standing barefoot in unfinished clothing. Civilization quietly rests upon invisible labor. It always has. Even medieval sumptuary laws, which attempted so confidently to freeze society into neat visual categories, ultimately reveal something rather hopeful. They existed because people constantly ignored them. If nobody ever dressed above their station, if nobody ever copied noble fashions, if nobody ever challenged expectations, there would have been no need for repeated legislation. Human curiosity proved stronger than regulation. Aspiration proved more stubborn than bureaucracy.
Fashion, it seems, has always enjoyed politely ignoring official instructions. History records countless attempts to organize humanity into perfectly ordered systems. Humanity almost always responds with cheerful improvisation. Someone adjusts the rules. Another borrows a better idea. Someone else quietly wears the forbidden color anyway. Civilizations continue, perhaps not exactly as governments intended, but often in far more interesting ways. As evening settled across medieval Europe, candles gradually replaced daylight inside homes. Families gathered around fireplaces. Travelers loosened muddy boots. Children yawned beneath heavy blankets. The expensive robes worn during ceremonies disappeared onto wooden pegs. Simple linen replaced embroidered wool. The day's public performances quietly ended. Titles mattered less beneath blankets. Silk and coarse wool warmed sleeping bodies almost equally once the room grew cold. Darkness possessed a curious equality. No matter how magnificent someone's clothing appeared during daylight, sleep eventually arrived, asking exactly the same thing of everyone. Close your eyes. Rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough. There is gentle wisdom hidden there. Much of what occupies our attention during daylight slowly loses importance by night. The opinions of strangers, professional titles, fashionable appearances, endless comparisons. They soften in darkness. The medieval world understood this without necessarily speaking it aloud. Mourning required clothing. Night required peace. Centuries later, museums now display fragments of garments beneath carefully controlled lighting. Visitors lean close to glass cases. They admire embroidery stitched by hands that vanished long ago. Tiny shoes, faded gloves, ancient belts, beautiful cloaks preserved almost accidentally through extraordinary circumstances. People whisper respectfully while observing these fragile survivors. It is difficult not to smile gently at the thought. Those garments were never intended to become museum treasures. Someone simply wanted warm feet, or a practical hood, or a respectable tunic for market day. History has a charming habit of celebrating objects that once considered themselves entirely ordinary. Perhaps one day, future generations will examine our own everyday belongings with equal fascination. They may wonder why we wore certain fabrics, why particular colors became fashionable, why comfortable clothing gradually replaced formal clothing in so many situations, why pockets kept getting larger or smaller. Historians of the future will undoubtedly develop wonderfully complicated explanations for choices many of us made simply because one shirt happened to be clean. Such is the delightful optimism of historical research. Yet perhaps those future scholars will reach the same conclusion we have quietly discovered tonight. Across centuries, technologies, and cultures, people remain remarkably recognizable. We all wish to be accepted. We all seek comfort. We all try to present ourselves well. We all carry memories attached to ordinary possessions. We all eventually discover that the things we own matter less than the lives we quietly build while using them. The cloth disappears. The humanity remains. So as tonight's story slowly settles into silence, allow those medieval villages to drift gently into the distance. The market stalls have closed. The tailor has folded away his measuring cord. The shepherd has gathered his flock. The merchant has locked his chest of colorful fabrics. The children have finally stopped chasing one another through muddy streets. The castle windows glow softly for a little while longer before their candles fade one by one. Across fields silvered by moonlight, simple cottages grow quiet. Inside them, cloaks rest on pegs. Shoes wait patiently beside doors. Wool blankets rise and fall with slow, sleeping breaths. Outside, the wind moves softly through trees that have watched countless generations come and go without ever hurrying them along. Time, after all, has never rushed anyone. It patiently carries every kingdom, every fashion, every law, every beautiful garment, and every ordinary life into the same gentle stillness. And perhaps that is the most comforting truth history has to offer. No matter how complicated the rules became, no matter how carefully people tried to define themselves through colors, fabrics, wealth, or social rank, every day eventually ended the same way. The belts were unfastened, the cloaks were folded, the candles burned low, the conversations faded into whispers. The worries of that particular day quietly dissolved into sleep, just as yours can now. So let your own shoulders grow a little heavier. Let your breathing settle into an easy rhythm. Allow the busy thoughts of today to loosen their grip one by one, like old ribbons untied at the end of a very long day. The medieval world has finally become silent again. Its colors have faded into moonlight. Its bustling streets have emptied. Its extraordinary clothing now rests peacefully inside forgotten wooden chests that only history remembers. And somewhere beyond those quiet centuries with nothing left to prove and nowhere left to hurry, the people who once worried so deeply about what they wore have become exactly what all of us eventually become. A gentle story carried forward by time, softly waiting for someone else to remember before drifting once more into peaceful, endless night.